All right, ready to dive into some Shakespeare.
Always up for a good tragedy.
Today, it's Romeo and Juliet. But with all the material you've given me, the play, notes from the Folger Shakespeare Library, even some Wikipedia stuff, seems like you want to go deeper than just the basics.
Definitely. I think there's a lot more to Romeo and Juliet than just star-crossed lovers.
Right, exactly.
We can really dig into how Shakespeare took an old story and made it his own. And how the language, even after all these years, still just grabs you.
Yeah.
Maybe even see how it's more relevant today than some people might think.
Okay, yeah, let's get into it. One thing that always gets me is how young Juliet actually is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you kind of picture her as like a senior in high school, right? But then I was looking at the Folger research, and Shakespeare actually gives her a very specific age.
He does, and it's much younger than most people realize.
Yeah.
Juliet is just a few days shy of 14, which, I mean, that's what, 9th grade these days.
13. Oh, wow. Okay, that really changes things.
It does.
I mean, it makes that whole whirlwind romance, the whole thing with Romeo, it's even more intense, right?
Yeah.
Maybe even more tragic when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it adds this whole layer of vulnerability to Juliet. She's like experiencing first love, but under these really intense circumstances. Plus, you got all the societal pressures of Verona at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Women had very little say in their own lives.
Right. And it's all happening in what? A week?
Exactly. It's a whirlwind.
It makes you look at that balcony scene totally differently. Okay, so speaking of those pressures, this whole feuding families thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it always seemed a bit much to me, like too dramatic,
Yeah.
like West Side Story almost.
Yeah.
But then I was reading the Wikipedia article, and it turns out Shakespeare didn't actually come up with this whole plot.
It's true. He borrowed quite liberally. There were earlier versions of Romeo and Juliet floating around. I mean, we're talking way before Shakespeare.
Wow, really? So what's different? What did he change?
Well, one big thing is how he deals with fate.
Fate. Like, were they always doomed?
Exactly. A lot of those older versions, they really hammered home this idea of cruel fate. These lovers, they're victims, almost puppets.
Mm-hmm.
But Shakespeare, he makes it more complicated.
So it's not just, oh, these poor kids, they never stood a chance.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you've got the feud. That's huge, obviously.
Right.
But Romeo and Juliet, they make choices. They're not just being dragged along by fate.
So they have some agency, some responsibility for what happens.
Exactly. A perfect example is when Romeo kills Tybalt. It's obviously an act of passion. He's just seen Mercutio die. He's furious, heartbroken.
Right.
But it's still a choice. And it has huge consequences.
That's true. It's like if he had just taken a breath,
right,
things could have gone very differently.
Absolutely. It's a good life lesson, even if you're not in a play.
Right. Think before you act. Okay, so can we talk about the language for a second?
Oh, the language.
I mean, reading Shakespeare, sometimes it's like I need a dictionary in one hand and a translator in the other.
It definitely takes some getting used to. But that's part of what makes it so brilliant.
Yeah.
Shakespeare, he was a master of using different types of language to really flesh out his characters.
Okay, yeah.
Take Mercutio. Think about that Queen Mab's speech.
Oh, right.
It's just this crazy imaginative monologue. It's almost like he's stream of consciousness, Fairies, dreams, all this wild stuff.
Oh, yeah. It's like, did Shakespeare have something in his coffee when he wrote this? It comes out of nowhere.
Exactly. It's such a departure from the rest of the play, and that's the point. It shows us Mercutio's personality. Quick wit, playful, a little bit wild. But it foreshadows the tragedy that's coming.
Wait, what? How so?
It's subtle, but Shakespeare uses that dreamlike language, that fantasy, to kind of remind us that appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes what we think is real, it's just an illusion. And of course, that's exactly what trips Romeo up later in the play.
Yeah.
He thinks Juliet's dead, rushes back to Verona, and the rest is history.
Right. All because he believed what he saw or what he thought he saw without, getting all the facts.
Exactly. It's all about miscommunication. And that's something that's so relevant even now, right? Think about how much we rely on texts and emails and social media, sometimes without really checking if it's true.
Oh, totally. Jumping to conclusions just like Romeo.
Yeah.
Okay, but Can we talk about actually staging this play? Because the whole, like, bare stage, minimal props thing,
Yeah.
it just seems so limiting. How do you convey all that drama, all those emotions, without, like, sets and lighting and special effects?
Well, that's what's so cool about how Romeo and Juliet has been performed over the years. Yeah. You're right. Back in Shakespeare's day, it was all about the actors, their voices, their costumes, and the audience's imagination. I mean, can you imagine trying to show the Capulet feast with just like a few chairs and a table?
Talk about using your imagination. It must have been a totally different experience, both for the actors and the audience.
Absolutely. But then as theater evolved, you start to see the staging get more elaborate. More sets, lighting, all sorts of special effects. By the 9th century, it's almost like opera, you know? Huge sets, lavish costumes, dramatic lighting.
From bare bones to, like, Broadway. I wonder what Shakespeare would think of it all. But even with all the bells and whistles, the core of the story, that never changes, right?
Exactly. Whether it's a bare stage in the 1500s or Baz Luhrmann with his crazy visuals and soundtrack.
And those Hawaiian shirts.
Exactly. The themes of love and hate and fate and the consequences of conflict, they transcend time. They still speak to us, no matter how the play is presented.
It's true. Speaking of different versions, I had no idea there were so many adaptations of Romeo and Juliet. Operas, ballets, films. They even made a gnome version.
Right. I think it just shows how much this story captures the imagination, but also how adaptable it is. Like, take that Luhrmann film. He is this classic story, sets it in like modern-day California, throws in guns instead of swords.
And that amazing soundtrack.
Right. It's a completely different take, but it works because at its core, it's still Romeo and Juliet. It's still about that intense young love, the pointlessness of hatred and violence.
So even though the setting's different, the emotional core of the story, that still comes through.
Exactly.
And actually that makes it, I don't know, even more tragic in a way. Because it's like we haven't really learned from the past, you know?
That's a really good point. And it's not just Luhrmann. So many adaptations, they use Romeo and Juliet to look at issues we're dealing with today. Gang violence, racial tensions, political divides. It's like this framework for understanding what happens when we let these divisions control us.
So it's not just a story about two teenagers who can't be together. It's a warning. It's relevant to what's happening in the world right now. But I keep coming back to this idea of fate. We've talked about how Shakespeare makes it more complicated, but like, where do you stand? Were Romeo and Juliet doomed from the start? Or did they actually have a chance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, were they always headed for disaster? Or could things have gone differently? It's something people have been arguing about for, what, 400 years?
Well, what's the answer?
Well, I don't think Shakespeare gives us an easy answer. It's not just, oh, fate wins, or, you know, they were doomed from the start.
It's not that simple.
No, it's more about how those choices, the ones Romeo and Juliet are making, how they play into everything else that's going on. They're not like puppets just following a script.
Right. They're making their own decisions, but those decisions have consequences.
Exactly. And those consequences, they kind of snowball. Each choice they make, it closes off other possibilities until they're kind of trapped.
Like when Romeo hears that Juliet's dead and he just like loses it.
He runs off half-cocked, doesn't even try to find out if it's true. He's just relying on what Balthazar told him.
Instead of waiting for Friar Lawrence's message.
Exactly. And of course, that message never gets to him.
Ugh, the worst timing ever. Talk about a communication breakdown.
It really shows you how important communication is, especially when things are intense, you know, high stakes. Because if you don't, look what happens to Romeo and Juliet.
Right. It makes you think twice about sending that angry text, doesn't it?
Right. Little miscommunication, it can have huge consequences. Maybe not quite as tragic as Romeo and Juliet, but still.
It makes you wonder, though, what if Romeo had just, like, taken a breath, waited for that message?
Right. What if he had? Would it have changed things? That's what makes this play so great. Centuries later, we're still asking these questions.
It really makes you think. So we've gone from star-crossed lovers to, like, the importance of double-checking your texts.
Right. But it's true. Even though it's like this old play, those themes, they still resonate, you know?
Absolutely. Love, loss, the pressure to conform, those things are always going to be relevant no matter what century it is.
Exactly.
Well, this has been amazing. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me. It's incredible how, like, even though it's a story everyone knows, there's still so much to uncover.
That's Shakespeare for you.
Right. Always more to discover. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Until next time.